On a quiet night in 1629, a ship, the Batavia, set sail from the Netherlands. It was a grand vessel equipped to carry passengers and valuable goods across the seas. What started as a hopeful journey, however, would soon spiral into one of the most disturbing and horrifying events in maritime history. The ship was not just heading for a distant destination, but toward an unimaginable tragedy that would become a dark tale of mutiny, death, and despair as the ship sailed toward its destination in the East Indies. The horror was not caused by storms or pirates, but by the very people on board, the crew and passengers who were about to experience a betrayal so deep it would shock the world. The Batavia disaster became infamous not just for its shipwreck, but for the unimaginable cruelty that followed. And while the world might remember the shipwreck and its consequences, the true terror of what transpired on the Batavia remains seared into history, a chilling reminder of the depths to which people can fall under extreme circumstances. The Batavia and its dark journey. The year was 1629. And the Batavia, a merchant ship owned by the Dutch East India Company, was making its maiden voyage from the Netherlands to the East Indies. It was a significant journey, not just for the goods it carried, precious spices, gold, and other valuable commodities, but also because of the passengers and crew on board. Among them were merchants, soldiers, and families hoping to start anew in the East Indies. The ship had been outfitted for a successful voyage, complete with 150 feet of deck space and 24 cannons. But it was not the size of the ship that would make this voyage memorable. It was the horror that would unfold on its journey. At the helm of the Batavia was Francisco Pelser, an experienced captain, but his leadership was soon to be tested in ways no one could have anticipated. His first officer, Ariane Jacobs, was also aboard. And while he had been a capable officer, he and Pelser shared a history of tension. Their relationship was strained, with both men vying for control, their egos clashing as the journey began. This created the perfect storm for disaster. But it wasn't just personal animosities that would lead to catastrophe. It was a dark plot brewing under the surface of the ship, one that would forever change the fate of all those on board. A mutiny in the making, while venturing toward its destination, found itself in a precarious position. It had already suffered from navigational errors that extended the journey. Supplies were running low, and the crew's morale began to falter. The heat, the cramped conditions below deck, and the growing discontent among the passengers were beginning to take their toll. Tensions were high, and whispers of rebellion were already spreading through the ranks. It was during these trying times that Ariane Jacobs, the first officer, began plotting a mutiny. Disillusioned with Pelsert's leadership, Ariane conspired with Geronimus Cornelis, a junior merchant who had a reputation for his heretical beliefs, and who had been sent on the voyage as a means of escaping prosecution for his controversial religious views. Geronimus was a man obsessed with his own twisted vision of power, and he had grandiose plans for what he called a new colony, where he would be the ruler. The Batavia was merely the means to his end, and the passengers and crew were nothing more than pawns in his sick game. Geronimus' plot was simple, yet devastating. His first plan was to create chaos on board by targeting the women and children, using a fabricated accusation of an assault to incite unrest. By framing one of the men in such a way, he and Ariane hoped to turn the crew against Pelser, weakening his control and setting the stage for their mutiny. This, however, would not go as planned, and it was only the beginning of a series of horrific events that would unfold on the Batavia. Shipwreck and survival. On June 4, 1629, disaster struck. The Batavia, off the coast of Australia, ran aground on a reef, its hull cracked and leaking. The crew scrambled to save themselves as the ship broke apart, sending many to the icy waters below. A handful of survivors managed to make their way to an island, which would later be known as Beacon Island. But their troubles were far from over. As the survivors began to regroup on the island, it became evident that the situation was dire. Supplies were scarce, and the island was inhospitable. The survivors were forced to rely on whatever they could salvage from the wreck. And tensions continued to rise as hunger, thirst, and illness began to take their toll, while Pelser had left the island to try and find help. His absence would soon reveal something far darker. Geronimus, taking advantage of the power vacuum, seized control of the survivors and declared himself their leader. His reign of terror began almost immediately. Geronimus's first act as leader was to confiscate all food, water, and weapons from the survivors, ensuring that no one could escape his control. Then, he began to systematically eliminate those who posed a threat to his leadership. Under Geronimus' orders, the survivors were divided into groups and sent on death. Missions to nearby islands, under the pretense of searching for food and water. However, Geronimus had no intention of rescuing them. Instead, he sent them to die, one group at a time. Those who disobeyed were executed without mercy. His cruelty knew no bounds, and his desire for power was insatiable. The survivors were left to fend for themselves, with no hope of rescue and no one to protect them from Geronimus' brutality. The final descent into madness. As Geronimus continued to tighten his grip on the survivors, the situation became even more grotesque. The survivors were subjected to physical and psychological torture, and many were driven to madness. The island became a place of fear, violence, and death. Geronimus, with his small group of loyal followers, eliminated anyone who opposed him, including the sick, the weak, and the elderly. Even the children were not spared. But the cruelty did not stop there. Geronimus' obsession with power and control led him to commit atrocities that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He would send groups of people to die in the most horrific ways, either by starvation, dehydration, or drowning. Many were thrown into the sea, and some were forced to march into the ocean, only to be left to die. By the time Francisco Pelsert returned to rescue the survivors, the island had become a scene from a nightmare. Pelsert had no idea what horrors had taken place in his absence, but when he arrived, he was met with a gruesome sight. He would later learn that Geronimus and his men had carried out mass executions, killing over 100 survivors. The aftermath of the Batavia's mutiny and shipwreck was as horrifying as the events that led to it. Geronimus and his loyal followers were captured, and a trial was held. Many of the survivors testified about the atrocities they had witnessed, and the truth about what had happened on the island was revealed. Geronimus was eventually hanged, but the scars of his actions would remain. The Batavia disaster is a chilling reminder of how quickly civilization can break down under extreme conditions. It is a dark chapter in history, one that exposes the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of unchecked power. The survivors of the Batavia would carry the memories of those dark days with them for the rest of their lives. And the legacy of the Batavia's mutiny and shipwreck continues to haunt history. If you like this content, please subscribe.